So I know there is interest in this topic because we started on it 2 hours ago or an hour and a half ago. So let's get right to it. And Bill, I want to ask you, as someone who is at the forefront of the fight in Indiana, on a personal level, walk us through the decision-making process that you went through to take a stand on that issue.
Well, certainly we were building a technology company in Indiana, and I've spent my entire life, I'm a native-born Hoosier, but worked out on the coast, and inevitably we're having to attempt to persuade people that Indiana's a wonderful place to work, and it's got a vibrant technology economy, and it's a great place for families. So we had an insatiable appetite for talent. We were trying to hire globally, and when this issue came up, it was obvious to me that it was going to directly impact our ability to execute our business plan. And then fundamentally, just on a personal basis, I thought it was wrong. It was morally wrong. So those two things, they don't always collide in the way that they did, but in this case, that happened.
Had there been other instances where you'd see things going on that personally affected you in the same way, but where you sort of didn't take an issue or you didn't feel like it was appropriate?
Oh, yes, inevitably. We had, for example, there was a legislative movement a few years ago to take punitive measures against undocumented workers. We don't have Angie's List did not have a labor force that consisted of any undocumented workers. But to me personally, that was a very important issue. But that was not something that, as a company, we were gonna take a position on. We just didn't have a relevant voice to state anything. So that would be a counterexample.
Ronnie, when we talk about what's happening right now with CEOs functioning effectively as activists, I think back, and Henry Ford famously decried capital punishment in the 1920s, but in the intervening century, we have not thought of CEOs as sort of animated by activist causes. What is happening right now that you think has led to this moment?
Yeah, something is going on out there. If you look at sort of with 2015, where Bill and Tim Cook from Apple and Mark Benioff from Salesforce got involved on a pretty obscure issue to the rest of the nation that really mattered for Indiana, which was this Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The question was, why? Why now? And we started to think about this in our research. And I think there's a bunch of different reasons. One is, this is a new generation of CEOs and COOs like Sheryl Sandberg. The generation that went to business school with Bill saw fundamentally different courses. They thought about the social impact of business, and we're reinforcing that today in business school. So there's much more of I think, an interest in these social issues. Two is, and we talked about this in the green room, there's a lot of gridlock in politics right now. And when people look at what's going on in government at the federal, the state, and the local level, a lot of business leaders think that, gosh, it's up to us to step up and try to break some of those log jams and make some things happen. So I think those are a couple reasons why it's happening now.
I gotta ask, because when we think about activism, I think the tendency is to think progressive, subtext progressive activism. CEOs like Tim Cook and you and Mark Benioff standing up for what they see are fundamentally progressive changes, right? But it works in the inverse too. And I'll point out Dan Cathy from Chick-fil-A, who stood up opposing same-sex marriage, and it was a PR and news sensation for Chick-fil-A, but ultimately helped Chick-fil-A's bottom line. So my question to you, Bill, is, how worried are you about the implications of CEOs getting involved in activism in a way that will theoretically engender activism on both sides of the aisle, if you will?
Yeah, I'm not worried at all. Public discourse is the foundation of democracy, and so corporations. Just like elected officials, they face the consequences. It could have gone either way for Chick-fil-A. It certainly could have gone either way for us. In some ways, we had a week or so of dealing with lots and lots and lots of angry people from across the country. But we also had huge support from the other side. That your customers and your shareholders will vote with their feet, and that has that can have benefits. It can have. You're never going to get that far out of where society is, whether it's behind or ahead. It doesn't matter. You're going to operate inside the boundaries of what you can operate.
Ronnie, one of the ways in which it seems like this is sort of the inevitable path forward is not just because there's institutional failure in certain sectors, but also because businesses, it sounds like, tend to be rewarded when their CEOs or when the business itself takes an active stance on an issue, right? So if there's that, I mean, and tell us a little bit what you found in terms of like how that incentivizes a company to do more of this.
So we looked at the context of Tim Cook speaking out on RFRA along with Bill Oesterle from Angie's List, and we found that not only do CEOs shape public opinion and convince people in that case that RFRA was a bad idea, it also engenders goodwill from customers. So we found that people who agreed with Tim Cook on, let's say, same-sex marriage or LGBT rights were more likely to want to buy Apple products after hearing what he had to say. And that was sort of a revelation for us because, corporations used to be pretty neutral. I mean, if you imagine, Michael Jordan has this famous quote in the 1980s where we asked him to get involved in a Senate race in North Carolina. And he said, "Why would I ever get involved on that? Republicans, they buy sneakers too." The issue here was neutrality was better than offending anyone. But now something different seems to be happening where the idea of having the conviction to stand up for what you believe in and willing to put up with the consequences. And you see a shift in a lot of companies. You see that in North Carolina, in Indiana, in Georgia, in all the states where this has happened.
Well, okay, so on one level, this is like incredibly heartening, right? And then, and I mentioned this to you guys in the green room where all great conversations happen, that it also has the potential to be sort of terrifying and maybe apocalyptic if the business world follows the same footsteps as Congress. I'll read you a quote from Mark Benioff, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Bill. "I think that CEOs today and business leaders are as important as political leaders, and that they have a role like political leaders, which is that they have to stand up for something. When things happen in the world that you don't agree with, as a CEO, you have a responsibility to come forward and say, hey, I don't agree with that because it doesn't support my employees or it doesn't support my customers." Now, we can see that as sort of provocative thinking around positive change, but couldn't we also end up with a partisan business landscape?
Well, I think there probably ultimately is a partisan business landscape. Inevitably, companies benefit from regulation when others are punished in regulatory environments. So, to some degree, it is. And again, my own view is you are going to be able to apply case-specific activism. Mm-hmm. It has to be relevant to your constituents, or it just won't happen, and that will ultimately define when people have a credible voice or when they don't have a credible voice. But I'm not concerned about people expressing their views is fundamentally a good thing, and if CEOs get outside of their own company's views, they tend to have real problems. Either people quit or they get fired as the CEO or they lose customers. And so there are protections in place.
I wonder what you think, Ronnie, about the more the veil is lifted about a company's politics, the more you're going to have brand loyalty that's rooted in something other than this specific product, but a set of ideals, right? So talk to me a little bit about how you see this kind of CEO activism changing the consumer landscape, right? Yeah, brand loyalty means something totally different.
Sure. I mean, Alex, there's a revolution now in marketing about personalizing brands, right? Brands want to be your friend. They want to have deep engagement with you. Well, think about this from the political science point of view. Our friendships, our neighborhoods, our schools are more based on political ideology than ever before.
Right.
We sort into neighborhoods and we watch television news shows that accord with our beliefs. Now imagine that a brand wants to be your friend. Well, now taking a political stand, right, being a progressive or a conservative, that might be much more important now than it was 20 years ago in establishing a relationship with the consumer. So ironically, some of the partisanship and polarization that we see, right, in the real world might have a huge impact on the way corporations market to people because political ideology is becoming so important. Right. I think that's something to watch.
Does that mean you want brand spokespeople who align with your values?
It's possible we could go that direction. I think the results of our study are pointing to something where if you agree with Tim Cook, you're more excited about Apple. And maybe if you agree with Dan Cathy, you're more likely to go to that Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day that Mike Huckabee organized, which was a big part of the response to the backlash. It's the backlash to the backlash that happens, which is interesting. But I will say one thing. For all those folks in the audience who are worried about corporate influence in our politics, Jane Mayer has this new book on the Koch brothers. We have to reconcile, on one hand, that we might be worried or disappointed about sort of corporate influence on the political process on one hand, but on the other, we might cheer CEOs who speak up on causes that we agree with. I think the key difference what I'm seeing with Bill and the things he's done is it's transparent, right? Bill's done this stuff under his own name, and people know who he is and what company he represents, and when it's him and not the company. There is a difference, but that's a kind of an interesting tension to look for as well.
Well, and Bill has done this, by the way, as a Republican. And I want to talk a little bit about the tension there because, on a certain level, going out there as you did on Angie's List and Religious Freedom Restoration Act, you could potentially be at odds with shareholders or some people that work for the same company. You also, in many ways, are at odds with your party on the subject of LGBT rights. And talk to me about how you navigated that and whether there have been repercussions for that.
Yeah, well, there's certainly, I was at odds with a significant portion of the party in the state. There's a division going on in the Republican Party right now, a very dramatic one. The business interests versus the sort of populist interests that have been exacerbated by gerrymandering. I mean, it's really bad. And in states like mine, where there are supermajorities, Republican supermajorities in both houses, the interests of the business community are becoming secondary to the interests of the fundamental right. That was tricky to navigate. We ended up on national Republican, or not even Republican, fundamentalist, website, email rings. I mean, it was.
Did you ever think, should I have done this?
Oh, certainly. Like. Daily, but we were talking. A bias to. I had a great board that was supportive, and then our employees. More importantly, the employees. I was holding dialogues with them, and had consistent expressions of support for the position, and that gave me the basis from which to work, But yes, as a Republican, look, progressive. I consider myself. I get called a moderate Republican a lot. I've never been moderate in anything in my entire life.
Well, that's a testament to something else, then, isn't it?
Yeah. But look, when it comes to issues of liberty and economic opportunity, those are things that appeal to me about the Republican Party, and having to fight for those a little bit at home these days.
Well, but do you feel like, and this is part of a larger question, do you feel like one of the reasons you were able to sort of get up and say, this isn't right, is because you felt like that kind of policy wasn't actually representative of the state and its constituents?
There is no question that that's true. Hoosiers are not, I've been there my entire life. And I ran Mitch Daniels' campaign in 2004, so I actually had the polling. I had seen it. I knew what their opinions were. The legislature and the governor were not representing the interests of the people.
Right.
Hoosiers they abhor discrimination, abhor it, and yet the legislature and the governor were portraying the place as one that's comfortable with discrimination, and that I knew fundamentally that wasn't. What Hoosiers are like, and so made it easy.
So I wonder, we are talking about why now, and it feels like this is a case where if part of a system is broken, other branches of the system take the load, and certainly the dysfunction in the legislative branch has bled over into the judicial branch, where the Supreme Court is now effectively a legislative body in many ways. But I see business engagement on these issues as also representative of an institutional breakdown in that area. Insofar as Bill points out, you have state legislatures that are acting not according to the will of the voters or the residents of the state, but because of a small and largely fractious minority that is in charge and crafting policy by and of itself. Mm-hmm. So my question to you, Ronnie, is, if we had a better functioning system at the state level and at the national level, would we see CO activism evaporate?
Well, I think one of the compelling cases for CO activism is that they represent the center in a lot of cases. Bill's reference to being a moderate. As you see a historic number of state legislatures and governor's mansions controlled by a single party across different states, we find a situation where you see extreme policies, especially as a result of gerrymandering. And so the center has not held in a lot of these cases. And I think for CEOs like Bill, or former CEOs like Bill and current CEOs, they represent the center and a reasonable voice. Even if you're from a different political party than Bill, when you were listening to him talk about why he stood up, mean, that was very reasonable. It made a lot of sense. It's the kind of person you might cross party lines to vote for. But those people don't exist as much in our current politics because the party system has sort of killed them off in a lot of ways. And so I think the CEOs can represent potentially that middle ground on some of these issues. I think LGBT issues, gay rights in general, is an important issue for companies because they settled a lot of this stuff, right, with corporate policy in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And so it's a lot easier for Mark Benioff to stand up or Bill Oesterle to stand up because they've lived by these things in their companies. On other issues, it's a little dicier. Look at Howard Schultz and Race Together at Starbucks. Trickier issue, right, and arguably not as successful in that case on that particular foray.
The thing that is, I think, cause for consternation is, look, government is always going to have to exist, right, in some fashion. And if we are sort of, in a way, giving up on that system of making a fairer, more equitable democracy, I mean, by outsourcing it effectively to the business world or to the bench, what are the implications for government, and how do you foster at least some cross-pollination between the moderate center agents of change, wherever they may be, and people in government tasked with actually carrying that out?
Well, I think it's in crisis that you actually get the cross-pollination. You get the. We stood up because there was a need, and people tend to do that. They're drawn into these discussions when they feel compelled to enter them, and that's what got me involved. It's what got our company involved. It's what got the little organization, the Tech for Equality, I've put together. All those CEOs, they would be content if everything were going just fine. They've got better things to do, but they're now active and engaged and involved and want to make a difference. So I didn't view what we were doing as somehow propping up a broken process. I viewed what we were doing as participating in improving the process. That's what participation does. So I'm a little more optimistic that this will all work out just fine. More people involved is a better thing, and unless they have something to be involved that moves them, they just tend not to.
Speaking of more people being involved, Bill, I know there's a hunt for an alternative to Donald Trump, maybe a third-party candidacy. Did it ever cross your mind?
Yeah, no. No, I have this friend, Mitch Daniels, that I wish it would cross his mind, or at least wish he would have run. But look, the Republican Party is a mess right now. It just is, and it's going to have. Internally, we're going to have to, as a party, resolve that. We're divided on many different levels, and coming down the pike, this immigration issue is going to be very interesting. The business community is in a very different place than much of the traditional party. It's just going to be fascinating to watch.
With that, we have time for one incredible question. Sir, if you could just start up and let us know who you are, name and affiliation would be great.
Hi, Chris Rollison. How would you think or package this in an overall trend of repersonalizing the economy? I mean, CEOs are not just figureheads of blah, blah, blah company. You're a person. And I see in my work that all aspects of business are becoming personal due to social media.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll let Bill talk from his perspective as CEO. I think Twitter and the ability to communicate directly to your consumers and their constituents is a huge part of this. You've seen a lot of the activism we talked about started on Twitter and really propagated on Twitter. So I think it's undoubtedly part of the story. It's given CEOs a mechanism and a way to speak quickly and clearly. I'm not sure it's the only thing that's going on, but it's a huge part of the story.
Yeah, and I think I agree with the trend. I mean, to the extent that the more companies appear to be talking directly to their consumers, the better it is. It just works in today's sort of marketing, and so I think personalization has a lot to do with this, and to some degree, maybe that's what causes. There have been types of activism for a long time, but maybe that's why corporate activism today is getting a little more attention.
Let me ask you guys one question in closing. From the CEO standpoint, Bill, what's the conversation like among CEOs on this topic?
It's really, it sort of depends on the environment and the audience, but it does come up. The vast majority, of CEOs they are tunnel vision focused. I mean, business is hard. Like, it is a lot of hard work. And so most of them are intently focused on just whatever the situation is that they're attempting to deal with. They're trying to expand their market. So to be in a, if you're in a group of them, you're typically talking about those specific business problems. But if you get in a group of them that share a common, so CEOs in Indiana in the RFRA crisis, you see the best and the worst of like how you want corporate responsibility to flow. Some of it's just, we got to get this over with, whatever it takes. Just it's got, it must end immediately, and all the way to, no, we've got to fix this for long term. Do the right thing, and that's just it's becoming more apparent as these issues pop up that they're going to have to devote more energy to it. You see people hiring in Indiana, government affairs staffs that never had them before, and Tech for Equality, these little tech companies that I'm working with, it never even occurred to them to get involved in things like this, but now they are.
And Ronnie, last question. Is this the inevitable outgrowth of corporate responsibility?
I thought about that a lot as I watched the earlier panels. I do see sort of parallel trends here. I mean, companies have spent a lot of time over the last 15, 20 years quantifying CSR, measuring it, making some really important investments in communities. I think that will continue. I think CEO activism will also continue in response to a lot of these laws that are being passed or considered around legislators. I do think the CEO activism gets a lot of press. I mean, can anyone in the audience name anything that PayPal's corporate social responsibility program has done? And they probably have a robust one, but you know that their CEO has decided not to create jobs in North Carolina with this activism pitch. So I think you'll see both of them. The CEO activism will get a lot more attention.
And so it goes. Thank you all for your time. Thank you, Bill and Ronnie, for your thoughts.